At 70 years old, Jimmy Fortune has finally broken his silence about the years he spent as a Statler brother, and what he says now is sending shockwaves through the country music world. For decades, fans only saw the smiling performer, the soaring tenor voice, and the gospel warmth in his lyrics. But behind closed doors, Jimmy was holding something back, something deep, painful, and unresolved. In a rare sit-down at his Virginia home, Jimmy opened up about the pressures of replacing a legend, the quiet sacrifices he made off stage, and a letter he wrote years ago that he never intended anyone to read until now. That letter, filled with regret, forgiveness, and a shocking confession about a moment with one of the Statlers before their retirement, may finally change how we see the group and Jimmy forever. Jimmy Fortune's entry into the Statler Brothers wasn't just a dream come true. It was a whirlwind, a test, and for many, an impossible act to follow. In 1982, Lew DeWitt, the group's original tenor and one of its founding members, was forced to step down due to his ongoing battle with Crohn's disease. His departure left a painful gap in one of country music's most beloved quartets. The remaining Statlers needed someone with not just talent, but humility, heart, and harmony, and they found all three in Jimmy. Jimmy was singing in a local ski lodge in Virginia when he got the unexpected call. Within days, he went from playing for casual crowds to standing under the bright lights of major stages with country royalty. But as glamorous as it looked on the outside, the transition was heavy with anxiety. Jimmy later confessed that in the beginning, he barely slept. The fear of not living up to Lew's legacy haunted him every time he stepped up to the mic. The fans didn't know him yet. Some didn't want to. And deep down, Jimmy feared he might be nothing more than a placeholder. What helped carry him through those early months wasn't just talent, it was songwriting. When Jimmy brought in a song he'd written called Elizabeth, the group knew they had something special. The song would go on to become one of their most iconic hits, not only showcasing Jimmy's voice, but solidifying his place as more than a substitute. He was now a Statler brother in his own right. Still, the weight of that responsibility never fully lifted. He traveled the world, met legends, and stood on the Grand Ole Opry stage countless times. But in the back of his mind, Jimmy often wondered if fans were comparing him to the man he replaced. He rarely talked about those doubts back then. Now, at 70, he admits that carrying another man's legacy nearly broke him, especially when Lew's health worsened and the guilt of replacing a friend crept in deeper than ever before. What Jimmy didn't know at the time was that Lew had written him a letter before he died, one that would remain sealed for years. That letter, when Jimmy finally opened it, would bring him to tears, and it revealed something he never expected. Life on the road with the Statler brothers may have looked picture-perfect from the outside. Crowds of adoring fans, sold-out arenas, and the glory of being part of one of the most celebrated country quartets in American history. But for Jimmy Fortune, it came at a steep personal cost. While he was belting out harmonies on stage, his personal life was slowly unraveling behind the curtain. Fame, he realized, is a demanding beast, one that takes more than it gives. Jimmy was gone for weeks, sometimes months at a time. His children grew up while he was chasing tour buses. His first marriage suffered, burdened by long separations, mounting expectations, and the emotional absence that even daily phone calls couldn't fix. There were times when he'd return home and feel like a stranger in his own living room. The spotlight gave him applause, but it took away birthdays, holidays, and quiet dinners with family. And for Jimmy, who always prided himself on being a family man, that was a wound that never fully healed. The constant pressure to perform, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, was unrelenting. He had to smile through exhaustion, sing through heartbreak, and suppress his doubts when the world expected perfection. Jimmy has said in recent interviews that there were nights he'd cry himself to sleep in hotel rooms, questioning whether the success was worth the loneliness. But he never let those feelings show. He was the new guy, the one who was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity, not the one complaining about the cost. Even worse, Jimmy often felt like an outsider in the very group he helped keep alive. The other members had decades of history together, inside jokes, old stories, and lifelong bonds that he could never quite break into. He was accepted, but only up to a point. The emotional distance between him and the others lingered like a quiet shadow backstage. He respected them immensely, but he rarely felt like he truly belonged. It wasn't until years later, long after the tours had ended and the costumes were put away, that Jimmy began to process what those years had really taken from him. The fame, the music, the accolades, they were all real, but so was the cost. And for the first time at 70, he's finally telling that part of the story. The part where the lights went off and the silence hit harder than any encore. Jimmy Fortune's story with the Statler Brothers is deeply tied to one of the most powerful truths in country music. Behind every harmony, there's heartache. And nowhere was that more evident than in the complicated, bittersweet bond between Jimmy and Lew DeWitt, the very man he replaced. When Jimmy first joined the Statlers, Lew's absence wasn't just logistical, it was emotional. Lew had been a founding member, the original tenor whose voice helped build the Statlers' entire identity. Fans adored him. The other members loved him like a brother. Replacing him, even temporarily, felt unthinkable. Jimmy wasn't just filling in for a sick man, he was stepping into a legacy, and he knew it. For years, Jimmy carried a heavy burden. Every time he stepped into the spotlight, he worried whether it would be seen as disrespect, whether fans still mourned Lew every time they applauded him. He walked a tightrope between honoring the man who came before him and trying to prove he belonged. In interviews, Jimmy rarely spoke about Lew, not because he didn't care, but because the emotions were too raw. But what fans didn't know, what Jimmy never told anyone until recently, was that he and Lew had a private meeting in the final months of Lew's life. It happened quietly, away from reporters and cameras. Lew, frail but sharp, had asked to see Jimmy. The two sat for hours, talking not just about music, but about life, faith, and forgiveness. Lew told Jimmy something that stunned him. "I couldn't have chosen a better man to carry the songs." He smiled, reached into a drawer, and handed Jimmy an envelope. "Don't open this until you're ready," Lew said. Jimmy didn't open that letter until more than a decade later. When he finally did, it changed everything. Inside was a handwritten note filled with blessings, memories, and a line that Jimmy says he still reads once a year. "You were never second best. You were sent." That letter gave Jimmy the peace he never allowed himself to feel. And it's that moment, one no one ever knew about, that helped him finally speak freely about the ghosts that haunted him. At 70, Jimmy now says, "Lew gave me the greatest gift, permission to be myself." And for Jimmy Fortune, that permission would open the door to a new chapter, one that would redefine not only his legacy, but his very purpose in music. After the Statler Brothers officially retired in 2002, many assumed Jimmy Fortune would fade quietly into the background like so many other group members do when the curtain closes. But that was never in Jimmy's spirit. If anything, stepping away from the Statlers gave him a chance to finally become the man and artist he had suppressed for decades. And while the spotlight may have dimmed on the quartet, Jimmy's own light was just beginning to shine on its own terms. For the first time in years, he wasn't confined to singing only harmonies. He wasn't limited to songs chosen by committee. Now he could tell his story through his music. His first solo album, When One Door Closes, released in 2003, felt like both a declaration and a quiet rebellion. It wasn't a flashy debut. It was deeply personal, raw, and filled with spiritual undertones. Listeners could feel it. Jimmy wasn't just performing anymore. He was revealing something. And that vulnerability struck a chord. Fans who remembered him from the Statlers now heard a different voice, not in tone, but in truth. Songs like More Than a Name on a Wall, originally sung with the Statlers, took on deeper meaning when performed solo by Jimmy. The war mothers, widows, and veterans who met him after shows often wept in his arms. And Jimmy, never one to rush a moment, stayed and listened. He says now that those conversations mattered more to him than any standing ovation. But it wasn't just the fans who were changed. Jimmy himself was transformed. Stepping out from behind the Statler shadow meant he had to face his fears. Was he enough on his own? Would anyone care without the legacy behind him? And slowly, over years of touring tiny churches, county fairs, and auditoriums, he found the answer. Yes, he was more than enough. His faith deepened during this period too. Jimmy began to lean heavily into gospel music, seeing it not just as a genre, but a lifeline. He believed he had been spared from obscurity, from bitterness, from the disease that took Lew DeWitt. And so, every song became an offering, a thank you, a testimony. Now, when Jimmy performs, it's not about reclaiming glory, it's about service. He sings for healing, for remembrance, for redemption. And at 70, with decades behind him, Jimmy Fortune has become something few artists ever managed to be, a voice that grows more powerful with time, because now it's finally his own. As Jimmy Fortune carved out his identity as a solo artist, the contrast between his life with the Statler Brothers and his life afterward became more striking. With the quartet, there were rules, unspoken expectations about image, tone, and what could or couldn't be said. The Statlers were traditionalists, rooted in a squeaky clean public image and buttoned-up showmanship. But on his own, Jimmy was free to dig deeper into the wounds, the regrets, and the miracles that shaped his path, and free to finally express the faith that had quietly carried him through the darkest nights. What many don't know is that Jimmy's solo success didn't come easy. In fact, there were years when he nearly gave up. After the Statlers disbanded, the phone didn't ring as much. Venues were smaller, budgets were tighter, and for a time, Jimmy found himself questioning if anyone still cared. He remembers sitting alone in a parking lot before a solo show in Georgia, one of the first gigs he booked by himself, and crying. "I thought I had made the biggest mistake of my life," he admitted. "But I walked in, sang my heart out to 50 people, and one woman came up to me and said, 'That song saved me.' That's when I knew why I was still doing this." That show became a turning point. Jimmy leaned into his authenticity. He began sharing stories on stage about his childhood, about his marriage struggles, about Lew, and even about the anger he once held toward God. Fans didn't just listen, they leaned in. It wasn't entertainment anymore, it was ministry. He also found healing in simplicity. No longer surrounded by the machinery of a major touring act, Jimmy embraced the quiet moments. Mornings with his wife Nina, coffee on the porch, fishing trips with his kids and grandchildren. For the first time in decades, he wasn't rushing to catch a flight or meet a press deadline. And in that stillness, his music deepened. Albums like Hits and Hymns and God and Country weren't just projects. They were reflections of his soul. By age 70, Jimmy had amassed more than just songs. He had gathered wisdom, and now he's begun writing it all down. He's spoken about a future memoir, not about fame, but about grace, about the high cost of harmony, about the friends lost along the way, and the quiet moments that gave it all meaning. What Jimmy Fortune has built since leaving the Statlers isn't just a career, it's a second life. And this one, he says, feels more honest than the first ever did. One of the most profound aspects of Jimmy Fortune's later years has been his relationship with the fans, the people who followed him from the Statler Brothers era into his solo journey, and those who discovered him much later through his gospel albums and heartfelt performances online. But what many don't realize is just how personal those connections have become. Unlike the stadium-sized shows of his Statler days, Jimmy's solo concerts are often intimate, emotional experiences, where the barrier between stage and audience seems to melt away. There's something almost sacred about the way Jimmy engages with his fans now. He doesn't just perform songs, he tells stories, often breaking down in tears while recalling the people who inspired his lyrics. He speaks directly to veterans, widows, caregivers, and children of the forgotten. And in doing so, he's become more than a performer. He's become a vessel of healing for thousands. Jimmy has always credited his faith for this change. He believes wholeheartedly that God gave him a second career, not for fame, but for purpose. And that purpose often reveals itself in quiet, surprising ways. Like the time he was approached by a man after a show in Tennessee, an older gentleman who hadn't spoken to his son in over a decade. After hearing Jimmy's song, I Believe, he said something inside him softened. He went home, called his son, and broke a silence that had nearly turned permanent. "You didn't just sing a song tonight," the man told Jimmy. "You saved my family." It's these stories, these faces, that have become the markers of Jimmy's legacy. Not awards, not chart positions, but changed lives. In interviews, Jimmy often reflects on the irony that his most impactful years came after the biggest chapter of his career had closed. While the world celebrated the Statler Brothers' retirement in 2002 with honors and Hall of Fame inductions, Jimmy was quietly starting over at an age when most people begin to slow down. But slowing down was never in Jimmy's blood. He felt called by something higher to keep going. Now, at 70, he performs fewer shows, but they're richer, more focused. He often brings family on the road, making the experience less about career and more about connection. He meets fans after nearly every concert, signs every photo, hugs every grandmother who drove 3 hours just to hear Elizabeth one more time. And maybe that's Jimmy's greatest gift, his ability to make every listener feel like they are the reason he's still singing, because in his heart, they are. While Jimmy Fortune's voice has remained remarkably strong through the years, it's his personal life, often kept private, that truly reveals the depth of the man behind the music. In recent interviews and appearances, he's opened up more than ever about his family, his past mistakes, and the quiet battles he fought when the spotlight faded. And it's clear, Jimmy's journey hasn't just been about music, it's been about redemption. He's spoken candidly about the strain that decades of touring placed on his first marriage, a painful chapter in his life that left him with regret. "I was always chasing something," he admitted, "and in the process, I missed out on what mattered most." Divorce, for Jimmy, wasn't just a personal failure, it was a spiritual crisis. It shook his faith, his confidence, and his understanding of what love was supposed to be. But that chapter, though dark, led him to something better. His second wife, Nina, became not only a partner in life, but a pillar of strength and faith. Together, they built a quieter world, one that prioritized presence over performance and peace over applause. Jimmy often credits Nina with grounding him, helping him reconnect with the values he'd once buried beneath years of relentless touring and obligation. Their home in Virginia is modest and warm, a reflection of their lifestyle. Jimmy isn't drawn to flashy cars or sprawling mansions. He prefers his porch swing, his guitar, and the morning quiet. Friends say he still drives his own truck to most shows, often with a trailer hitched behind him packed with equipment. There's no entourage, no spectacle, just Jimmy. He's also found tremendous joy in being a grandfather. The man who once missed holidays is now known for making pancakes on Saturday mornings, teaching his grandkids old Statler Brothers harmonies, and filming silly home videos that rarely leave the family group chat. For Jimmy, legacy isn't about platinum records anymore. It's about what his grandchildren will remember about him, not just his songs. And yet, even in this peaceful stage of life, Jimmy hasn't stopped creating. He continues to write music, sometimes from scraps of dreams, sometimes from stories shared by fans. Each song, he says, is a prayer, a reflection, a thank you. Because after all these years, Jimmy Fortune knows he's been given something rare in the music business, a second chance to sing with a full heart and a clear soul. At 70 years old, Jimmy Fortune's voice may be what brought people in, but it's his story that's made them stay. His journey from small-town Virginia to global stages with the Statler Brothers, and then through the winding, humbling road of solo artistry is nothing short of remarkable. But the most powerful truth of all? Jimmy isn't chasing anything anymore. He's arrived, not at a destination of fame, but of peace. In his final reflections, during interviews and on stage, Jimmy often brings up the idea of calling, not career, not opportunity, but calling. He believes his voice was given for a reason far bigger than radio airplay or chart positions, and now in his later years, that calling has crystallized. To comfort the hurting, to uplift the weary, and to remind people, through music, that they are not alone. One of the most profound examples of this came during a recent appearance at a small country church in Kentucky. After performing a stripped-down set of gospel tunes and Statler classics, Jimmy took a moment to speak directly to the congregation. His voice cracked as he talked about Lew DeWitt, about second chances, about grace. Then he paused, looked out over the pews and said, "If you're still breathing, God's not done with you. I'm living proof." That moment, captured on a fan's cell phone, went viral not because it was polished, but because it was real. A man who had sung on the biggest stages in the world, now sharing the same message in a humble chapel. And that's the paradox of Jimmy Fortune. The bigger his heart has gotten, the smaller his stages have become, and the more powerful his presence has felt. He's still recording, still writing, and while mainstream attention has moved on to younger artists with flashier sounds, Jimmy remains steady, rooted, relevant, not because of trends, but because of truth. His music reminds us of a time when songs told stories, when voices carried the weight of lived experience, and when artists sang because their hearts were too full not to. Jimmy Fortune's legacy isn't just etched in awards or accolades. It lives in the tears of the people who hear Elizabeth and think of a lost mother, in the smiles of veterans who hear more than a name on a wall, and in the quiet peace of a man who finally knows he was always enough. At 70, Jimmy Fortune has nothing left to prove, but everything left to give.